Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is a presentation surrounding the health benefit of red meat through evidence-based epidemiology. My name is Perle Malka. I am currently a Master's of Public Health student at Los Angeles Pacific University, specializing in epidemiology. My presentation will attempt to uncover the truth about the consumption of red meat and its effect on our health. Together, we will start by looking at several public health recommendations currently on the web for Americans and others to follow. I would expand on the supporting evidence, some projections for the future, possible solutions, and finally conclude with my personal recommendation based on what we learned today. Let's get started, shall we? If you have felt like me in the past, then you would agree that sometimes it feels that we are on a red meat roller coaster. We are bombarded with ads for red meat and news headlines such as this one, asking if red meat is killing us in one, while the other states that red meat reduces cancer risks. Confused enough yet? Well, so let's see if these ads are going to leave you hungry or hungry for change. First, let's clarify some terms because they are repeated with few variations in several studies. Red meat is unprocessed mammalian muscle meat. The examples are beef, veal, pork, lamb, mutton, horse, or goat meat. It also includes frozen meat. Processed meat, on the other hand, is any of those meat, but it has been transformed in some way. The transformation is usually through curing, smoking, salting, fermentation, and other processes to improve preservation and enhance flavor. Some of the examples in these categories are bacon, sausage, ham, bologna, hot dogs, and deli meats. Let's dive in the public health recommendations that are out there with the highest esteem. Public health recommendations and dietary guidelines are meant to keep you away from this very stretcher, but what we find out there is that the recommendations are conflicting with one another. The first recommendation is from the American Institute of Cancer Research. They recommend about 300 grams of unprocessed red meat per week and 0 grams of processed meat. 300 grams, to give you a visualization, is about 1 lean steak. The American Cancer Society, on the other hand, recommends no red meat at all, whether it is processed or unprocessed, per week. The USDA is the United States government guideline, and they are making their guidelines in what is called the Dietary Guidelines for American. They recommend more red meat than anyone out there. 737 grams of unprocessed red meat per week, and they offer no details on the processed meat. Let's elaborate on the last recommendation we just outlined, the USDA Guidelines for American. I briefly noted early that this guideline plays a crucial role in policy making, health promotion, and attempts to reduce chronic disease risk. The actual guideline states 26 ounces, but I took the liberty to convert this amount into grams to give you a solid frame of reference for the other two. You may have heard in the past of the 4 food groups or the pyramid guide. Today, they market the recommendation as My Plate. I did not choose this guideline for my recommendation because although they use verbiage such as grounded on robust scientific reviews or based on the current body of evidence, they attach no studies to their guidelines, so it is difficult to verify their claims. So through my research, I found they had several competing interests that could have very well influenced their advice, such as influential political lobbies or their new commitment to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is the United Nations framework on climate change. And as you may already know, cattle is a bigger source of greenhouse gases emission, more even than any modes of transportation combined. Therefore, there may be several competing interests and conflicts of interest with their recommendation. Next is the AICR. To recap, they recommended 300 grams of unprocessed meat and no processed meat, and it was published in 2007. I was impressed with this guideline because they used a whole of government, whole of society approach, which ended up being conducive to limiting the recommendation of red meat as noted. For instance, they looked at beneficial dietary foods such as legumes high in fiber, being active, and not overweight, amongst other lifestyle choices in order to make their recommendation. They offer crucial evidence and explain why. For instance, they explain that a plant-based diet is optimal and is also better for the environment. But they also make note of the fact that red meat is nutritious and acknowledge that it is not easy keeping a balanced diet by entirely removing red meat. Therefore, their recommendation is conscious of the user and national context. Thus, it is more likely to have a higher adherence rate. If you have a moment, I included a link for their interactive cancer matrix. It is very useful to understand how red meat compares with other food lifestyles. It clearly shows an increased cancer risk if red meat is consumed, but not more than cigarette smoking or drinking alcohol. Last is the 2020 guidelines published by the ACS. To recap, they recommended no consumption of red meat. Overall, they, in fact, had the most well-supported and robust body of evidence to support their claims. Like the AICR, they also used a whole-of-society approach, but strictly focused on evidence-based data and its effect on public health. They show a very strong correlation with red meat consumption and colorectal cancer. In fact, one's risk increases specifically by a whopping 23% per ounces of serving. However, it is important to note that randomized controlled trials are the golden standard in clinical trials, and to adhere to ethical standards for scientific research, it is unlikely to occur. So how exactly can we trust the science backing the recommendation? Let's find out! One way is to look not only at data or red meat and cancer, but also to look at how red meat influences health outcomes with other diseases and reduce for compounding factors that may have biased the observational or cohort studies. What they found is that their guideline was consistent with the American Heart Association and the American Diabetes Association. Moreover, they do not simply describe their recommendation through evidence-based recommendations, but also proposed mechanisms, and we will go into those in details in the next couple slides. Last, they elevated their guidelines with a comprehensive body of evidence, ranging from the notorious IARC research, an umbrella organization of the World Health Organization, to the World Resources Report, which is committed to creating a sustainable future for our food supply. They also strengthened their data with systematic reviews and meta-analysis and prioritize evidence from randomized controlled trials while downgrading evidence from observational studies. So what are they really saying? Eat more chicken. The next section focuses on unpacking the body of evidence through the eyes of an evidence-based epidemiologist. To clarify, the evidence that suggests a strong correlation on red, unprocessed, and processed meat and how it increases cancer risk has existed for decades. To frame this issue within the American population context, know that currently cancer is the second leading cause of death and is only exceeded by heart disease. In some states, it actually is the leading cause of death, especially in the Hispanic and Asian subpopulation. A humanistic viewpoint is merited. If you, like I, have experienced this illness firsthand, you can imagine that the cancer burden extends beyond mortality and the affected individuals. The physical suffering and distress substantially affects the lives of the families and caretakers as well. Which is why we collectively attempt to identify and target the social behaviors that have potential of reducing cancer burden overall. You can witness interdisciplinary collaboration from those affirmation agencies. Some of these studies concluded that processed meat was convincingly correlated with colorectal and breast cancers and forms of prostate cancers. The IARC made a powerful claim in 2015 after careful review. They are an intergovernmental agency forming part of the World Health Organization of the United Nations. Its sole role is to conduct and coordinate research into the causes of cancer. They explore both epidemiological and laboratory research into the causes of human cancer, and their 2015 classification surely made headlines. It was a source of uproar from the meat production sector. The expert panel concluded that processed meat is a Group 1 carcinogen, and red meat is a probable Group 2A human carcinogen. Imagine that. Across the board, we evaluate health risks and red meat. We see a 16% increase cardiovascular mortality risk and a 23% increase in all-cause mortality associated specifically to processed meat. Other studies found that increasing consumption of red meat by at least half of a serving per day over 8 years was associated with an increase of 13% mortality risk for processed meat. Looking at colon cancer specifically, they noted risk increases by 23% with each additional serving. Meat and insulin studies are crucial to support that red meat is the cause and no other confounding factors, because the biological mechanistic model in humans is already well understood. Last, it was found that eating patterns that reduce consumption of red meat was associated with lower risks of comorbid illnesses such as obesity and type 2 diabetes. Now, like any good investigator, you must weigh all evidence and all sides before making deductions. So what is the big deal about red meat? Well, it is a cut above, especially when looking at the nutritional content of foods that comprise our average diets. Red meat is undoubtedly a nutritional powerhouse and a great source of energy comprised primarily of protein. Moreover, it contains 8 essential amino acids, which cannot be synthesized and must be consumed through our diet. All plants' protein lack at least one essential amino acids, but eating different plant foods together can compensate for the limiting amino acids. The fat found in meat helps with the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins such as vitamin A, D, E, and K, and is a rich source of micronutrients essentials for our health. Last, meat is a rich source of vitamins and minerals such as A, B6, B12, D, E, niacin, phosphorus, iron, zinc, and selenium. Scientists make sure that they weigh in the hierarchy of research and create level of strength of evidence based on their ability to control for bias and to demonstrate cause and effect in humans. Remember when I told you that their evidence was robust? What I meant is that although we cannot conduct primary randomized controlled trials for ethical reasons, we can, to some extent, bypass lower strength of evidence studies by conducting secondary studies in meta-analysis and systematic reviews. This method also strengthened the basis for the recommendation. Going back to being a good investigator, I explore what the critics are saying. They make claims that epidemiology wasn't a real science, that relative risks aren't significant enough, and disparage the IARC for their classification model. Our answers to these claims lie in the consistency from their recommendations, which focus primarily on cancer, and note that recommendations made by unaffiliated researchers studying obesity and type 2 diabetes led to the same conclusions. Also, 16% increased risk might not mean much to one's individual risk, but when we compound mortality rates as it relates to red meat consumption across the board for cancer, ischemic heart disease, obesity, and type 2 diabetes, the RR values are absolutely significant. Last, critics are misinterpreting the meaning of the strength of evidence concept, and accordingly, overall strength of evidence is presented as it relates to the potential for the particular exposure to cause cancer. To make claim, you must support it with strong biological mechanistic models. Several models have been explored and presented as supportive evidence. 3 in particular looked at heme iron, chemicals in the cooking process, and nitroso compounds. While they are valid, they place lower in the hierarchy of research design's pyramid. Thus, I give the main stage to the human research studies done on obesity and type 2 diabetes. The most substantial causal mechanical factor relates to cancer progression and its relation to high plasma insulin levels or hyperinsulinemia. An analysis showed that higher red meat consumption was positively correlated with insulin levels and insulin resistance. This diagram explores in detail direct and indirect biological mechanisms on tumor cell growth. Mechanistic evidence is strongly supported with epidemiological human research and data on relative risk. Meta-analysis of cancers in different organs of diabetic patients show the relative risk is almost tripled, as isn't the case for liver cancers. Obesity and cancer findings also strongly support a robust increased relative risk. Let's put all of this in perspective. 302 million cattle slaughtered for meat each year. Now, that's something that truly breaks my heart. The projected forecast is also very grim. We're looking at cancers increasing by 70% by 2040. The global prevalence to increase for diabetes is 10% by 2045. Ischemic heart disease to increase by 32.4% globally due to population aging, and 22.1% because of the increased population. For adult obesity, an increase of 60 to 80% of the population in Western countries by 2050 is forecasted. Demand for animal-based product foods are to increase by 70%, and without action, cropland and pastures are projected to increase by 600 million hectares by 2050. In a world where global temperatures have risen by 2 degrees Celsius, the sector must address the demand while reducing emissions by 2/3 from the 2010 levels. Are we truly the consumer, or are we the consumed of our dietary habits? Even if we accepted our current health condition as a matter of fact, our projected consumption for red meat is unpalatable to say the least, especially when decomposing the symbolic construction of meat consumption. Based on this industry's current state and accounting for population growth, economic progress, changing consumer preferences, and the demand for livestock products in developing countries, is not at all feasible on multiple levels. When one factors this in terms of the necessary natural resources, which includes landmass, access to livestock, feed, rainfall, and robustness of the economy, those major determinants make it an economically unviable industry. Beef production projections are also characterized by strong societal concerns for the environment, animal welfare, increased risks of exposure to dangerous zoonotic pathogens, and antibiotic resistance, which is a public health concern of its own. Now, if your question remains, should you give up red meat? Well, know that grass-fed organic beef contains higher levels of omega-6 and omega-3. The red meat is a good source of protein, iron, and other micronutrients. For those who consume it, lean rather than fatty cuts are preferred. Poultry and fish are valuable substitutes for red meat as well. The recommendation is not to completely avoid eating meat. Meat can be a valuable source of nutrients, but it is not an essential part of the diet, and that is really what you truly must remember. Meat-free diets can provide adequate amounts of all the necessary nutrients we require. People can obtain adequate protein from a mixture of pulses, such as legumes and cereals. Iron is present in many plant food, though it is less bioavailable than in meat. My final recommendations then would say take a vacation from beef when you can. A whole of government, whole of society approach is necessary to create environments for people and communities that are conducive to limiting consumption of red meat and processed meat especially. My public health goal is for the average consumption of red meat being less than 250 grams a week of lean, unprocessed red meat, very little, if any, ever to be processed at all, and also try meat alternatives. The amount of red meat specified is to provide a balance between the advantages of eating red meat as a source of essential macro and micronutrients and the disadvantages we presented to you today. Become a flexitarian and attempt to learn how can you become a healthy vegetarian without consuming too much dairy products as well. My proposed solutions lie in breaking down the boundaries between nature, science, society, and technology, which can lead us to imagine different futures and renounce thoughtless industrial farming. The first recommendation lies in a culture change, and what I mean by culture is meat culture. we must continue to enhance technology in lab-grown beef industries. We must increase the availability of non-meat food choices such as Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers. Next, I looked at a study that showed that a 10% excise tax and mandatory warning label on processed meat would be a cost-saving strategy with substantial health and economic benefits. The third recommendation is become a flexitarian, as I mentioned earlier. If one must consume meat for dietary purposes, then try to only eat meat on weekends, for instance, and become a vegetarian on weekdays. My last recommendation has to do a lot with what happened to me while doing my research. Reading the word red meat so many times made me crave red meat. And so I would say that to reduce marketing across the board on red meat consumption or red meat products. It was said that commercial speech of advertising is a cultural phenomenon whose social significance far exceeds its economic influence. And I was able to leave that firsthand through my research. Now here are my references, but please feel free to reach out and contact me if you have any questions at all. I truly hope that you enjoyed this presentation as much as I enjoyed preparing it for you. Have a wonderful day and make sure to share this with others.